It seems that when it comes to security policy these days, everybody wants to be a realist. The problem is, if you look at, for example, Barack Obama's policies and recommendations with respect to nuclear weapons and missile defenses, they're anything but realistic. In fact, there's a sort of school that they seem to reflect, some people call it progressive realism, that is just so ridiculously removed from reality that if it weren't so serious in terms of the implications of those policies and approaches, it would be hilarious. But it is serious. And what I'm afraid is going to happen if Barack Obama's recommendations are heeded, were they actually somehow to be implemented, the world would be, in fact, a far more dangerous place, particularly for America and its interests. Take, for example, the idea of ridding the world of nuclear weapons. Now, people have tried ridding the world of various other kinds of weapons with dismal results. And frankly, no matter how many world leaders, no matter how many elder statesmen, no matter how many other authorities stipulate that we have to get rid of nuclear weapons in order to make the world safe, it isn't going to happen. In fact, there's only one country on earth that Barack Obama can absolutely, positively, reliably denuclearize, and that's ours. And the problem is, we're well on our way, unbeknownst to most Americans, to doing just that. When you add on top of where we are, some 17 years after we last tested a nuclear weapon, with no capacity in this country to build new nuclear weapons, aside from sort of on a hand-built basis, a declining infrastructure, both in terms of the people and in terms of the facilities that are necessary to support our nuclear deterrent, and dramatically fewer numbers, even before Barack Obama gets started with his meat axe, dramatically fewer numbers of weapons in our arsenal, which means that the ones that are left absolutely, positively have to work, have to be safe, have to be reliable in order to be a credible nuclear deterrent. And that's the problem. I think increasingly people recognize, certainly inside the government, and I suspect both our adversaries and our friends, that America's nuclear deterrent isn't what it used to be. And that is an ominous thing, because far from curbing the phenomenon of worldwide nuclear proliferation, which is real and intensifying, diminished confidence in America's deterrent is going to do two things. One, it is going to cause our enemies to have ambitions to build up their nuclear capabilities, something, frankly, all of them are doing right now anyway, but will be only that much more certain, will translate into strategic value if they redouble the effort. Similarly, our friends, our allies around the world who have for years relied upon what's known as our extended nuclear deterrent or nuclear umbrella will be induced to go get their own, because they can no longer be sure ours will in fact protect them, particularly in neighborhoods, which they almost certainly live in, where bad guys are getting the bomb. Bad as the administration's nuclear weapons policy approaches are, an even more exotic, indeed ridiculous example of progressive realism is the administration's response to the proliferation of ballistic missiles, with which not only nuclear weapons, but chemical weapons, biological weapons, even conventional weapons can be delivered over longer and longer distances. At the very moment that we see the Russians building new generations of ballistic missiles designed to defeat missile defense, and we see the Chinese building new generations of ballistic missiles not only to threaten Taiwan, but also to attack our carrier battle groups, and for that matter, the United States. We also see North Korea and Iran testing missiles that seem designed to threaten nuclear attacks against the United States, including perhaps something known as strategic electromagnetic pulse attacks, which, as Bill Fortune in his new book, 1 Second After, vividly discusses, we could find ourselves transformed in literally the blink of an eye following such an EMP attack from an advanced 21st century superpower into a pre-industrial society. Indeed, the chairman of the commission in Congress that looked into this whole threat of electromagnetic pulse attack concluded that if an attack like those that the North Koreans and Iranians seem intent on having the ability to execute were to be inflicted upon the United States, within the space of a year, 9 out of 10 Americans would die. Not as a direct result of the effects of attack, but the indirect effects, as the electromagnetic pulse fries our electrical grid and electronic devices, and our entire society, which is so dependent upon those devices, essentially comes to a screeching halt. And people are left to fend for themselves without food, without water, without transportation, without communications, without transportation. The kinds of things upon which our society critically depends and without which we literally cannot survive, at least not most of us. So those are the sorts of threats that are developing. What's the response by the Obama administration? To cut ballistic missile defenses, especially those that are designed to protect the United States itself against EMP and other kinds of ballistic missile attack. To close down, despite 2 different agreements by NATO, to build a missile defense system in Europe for the protection of Europe and, by the way, the United States. And thirdly, to essentially get back in the business of negotiating bilateral treaties restricting missile defenses with the former Soviet Union, as though somehow we were back in the Cold War, as though somehow the only threat that we worried about was from Russia. It's certainly not. It is worldwide, and leaving ourselves vulnerable to it is an act of not just irresponsibility, but recklessness. I'd like to offer an alternative model of realism. It's conservative realism. Unlike progressive realism, which sort of is invested in the idea that if only the United States stops doing things that are eminently sensible in light of how the world really is, and then thus becomes a model for how the rest of the world should be, that the rest of the world will somehow be that way. American security policy needs to be rooted in realism, all right. It's just it ought to be realism in the sense of, if you will, conservative realism, which is to say, basing American policies and behaviors on the way the world really is, the way it historically has been and the way common sense tells us it will be in the future. Not in some fantasy about how it will behave if only the United States disarms. Thank you for listening.